Imagine standing between two facing mirrors, your reflection repeating into infinity, each image slightly softer, slightly more distant, yet unmistakably you. Now, let that image dissolve, and replace it not with glass, but with another person. Not your face, but your rhythm, your gestures, your pauses, the cadence of your voice, even the quiet hum of your emotional state. This is the essence of the mirror effect, an invisible, almost ghostly echo that passes between people in conversation, so subtle it rarely registers in conscious thought, yet so powerful it can build trust before a single promise is spoken or a single favor asked. The mirror effect isn't mimicry in the theatrical sense, it's far quieter, far more primal. It's the unconscious tendency we all share to align our posture with the person across from us, to match their speaking pace, to adopt similar hand gestures, even to breathe in sync. When you lean forward slightly and they follow, or when your voice softens and theirs does too, something ancient in the brain takes note. Neuroscientists call this neural resonance, a kind of silent harmony between nervous systems. Social psychology confirms what intuition has long sensed: people who mirror one another are perceived as more likable, more trustworthy, even more intelligent. And the most astonishing part? The mimicry doesn't need to be deliberate, or even noticeable. In controlled experiments, participants who were subtly mirrored, through a slight tilt of the head, a repeated phrase, a matching laugh, rated their conversation partners as significantly more persuasive and agreeable, despite having no awareness that mirroring had occurred at all. But here lies the truly mind-bending implication: this resonance doesn't require genuine alignment of belief or values. You could be speaking with someone whose worldview opposes yours entirely, politically, ethically, emotionally, and yet, by simply echoing their behavioral rhythm, you can create a bridge of comfort and familiarity. Their brain isn't asking, "Do I agree with this person?" It's asking, "Does this person feel like me?" And if the answer is yes, even superficially, doors open. Walls lower. This reveals a quiet truth about human connection: it is often less about authenticity than about pattern recognition. We are wired to trust echoes, not because they speak truth, but because they feel safe. In a world of uncertainty, sameness becomes sanctuary. So take a moment to reflect. When have you felt that sudden, inexplicable sense of being in sync with someone, perhaps a stranger on a train, a new colleague, someone you just met at a party, only to realize, hours or days later, that you barely knew anything about them? That feeling wasn't magic. It was mirroring. And once that sync is established, what if you could gently nudge them to reveal even more? Not by asking directly, but by offering a quiet echo of your own vulnerability, your own humanity? That brings us to the next layer of this psychological dance, the Me Too tactic. You share a small struggle. Maybe you admit you spilled coffee on your shirt before an important call, or confess you still get butterflies before speaking in front of a group. And then it happens. Their eyes soften, their shoulders relax, and they lean in with a knowing smile. Oh my God, me too. In that instant, something shifts. The air between you grows warmer, the distance shorter. Walls that were never visible suddenly dissolve. Why does this simple phrase, "me too," carry such quiet power? Because it isn't merely agreement. It's an unspoken covenant: you are not alone. I, too, am imperfect. I, too, am human. And in that shared imperfection, trust begins to bloom. This is the heart of the Me Too tactic, a subtle but profound psychological principle rooted in reciprocal disclosure. Human beings are wired for symmetry and vulnerability. When one person offers a small, authentic glimpse into their own fallibility, it creates a gentle social pressure for the other to respond in kind. This isn't manipulation in the cynical sense, it's more like emotional choreography. The key lies not in how deeply you confess, but in how relatably. A carefully chosen admission, "I still can't parallel park," or "I sometimes reread old text messages wondering what I missed," doesn't expose your core, it reveals your surface in a way that feels universal. And because it's minor, it feels safe. That safety is the invitation. The other person doesn't feel interrogated or cornered, they feel seen, and in return, they offer a piece of themselves, not out of obligation, but out of relief. They realize they're speaking with someone who understands the quiet stumbles of being human. But here's where the waters grow deeper and slightly murkier. What if your me too isn't spontaneous, but strategic? Not dishonest, but deliberately selected to open a specific door? Suppose you're trying to connect with a colleague who seems guarded. You might mention how overwhelmed you felt during last quarter's deadline, not because you're seeking sympathy, but because you suspect they felt the same. Your vulnerability is real, yet its timing and framing are intentional. This blurs the boundary between genuine connection and soft influence. Are you bonding, or baiting? The unsettling truth is that the line may not matter as much as we think. Because even when the initial disclosure is calibrated, the response it evokes is often authentic. The other person's relief, their laughter, their own confession, they are real emotions, born of a real moment. And in that moment, closeness forms, regardless of intent. This is the paradox at the core of human interaction. Sincerity and strategy are not always opposites. Sometimes, the most honest connections begin with a gently placed seed. Consider how often we withhold our small truths, fearing judgment, only to discover, when someone else speaks first, that we've been carrying unnecessary weight. The Me Too tactic, at its best, is an act of generosity, offering your own stumble so someone else feels safe to stand. It reminds us that intimacy isn't built in grand declarations, but in the quiet exchange of "I've been there too." And once that door is open, once they've shared something real, what if you could gently guide their attention not to their flaws, but to their potential? Not by praising who they are, but by reflecting who they could become? That's where the next layer of influence unfolds. Most of us have been taught that the path to connection is to shine the spotlight on the other person, to compliment their achievements, admire their style, or applaud their intelligence. And while that often works, it has limits. Praise affirms who someone already believes they are, it reinforces the known. But the true psychological advantage lies not in illuminating the present self, but in gently turning the light toward a future one, someone they haven't fully become, but might already sense within themselves. This is the essence of reversing the spotlight, not flattery, but reflection. Not "you're great," but "I see something in you that even you might not fully recognize yet." Reversing the spotlight operates on a subtle but profound shift in language and perception. Instead of labeling someone with a fixed trait, "You're so smart" or "You're a natural leader," you describe them in terms of their capacity, their trajectory, their latent potential. You might say, "The way you asked that question shows a rare kind of curiosity," or "I've never met someone who listens with that kind of depth. It makes people feel truly heard." In doing so, you're not commenting on their identity as it stands, you're offering a mirror to an aspirational version of themselves. This taps into a well-documented phenomenon in social psychology known as the looking glass self, the idea that we come to understand who we are largely through how we believe others see us. When someone reflects back a version of us that is wiser, braver, or more insightful than we currently feel, we don't just appreciate the compliment, we begin to live into it. We adjust our behavior, often unconsciously, to align with that reflected image. It's not manipulation, it's invitation. What makes this approach so quietly powerful is that it sidesteps the defensiveness that often accompanies direct feedback or even excessive praise. Criticism threatens the ego because it implies deficiency. Generic praise can feel hollow because it lacks specificity. But aspirational reflection? It flatters the soul without inflating the ego. It says, I see the seed, and I trust it will grow. And because it's framed as observation rather than demand, the recipient doesn't feel pressured, they feel seen. They feel believed in. And belief, especially when it comes from someone whose opinion they value, can be a catalyst for transformation. Yet this power carries a quiet weight. To name someone's potential is also to place it within their awareness, and with awareness comes responsibility. If you tell someone they have a gift for calming tense situations, they may start noticing moments they failed to do so. If you reflect back their capacity for original thought, they might feel anxious when their ideas feel derivative. In this sense, reversing the spotlight is not without consequence. It raises an ethical whisper. Is it kind to hold up a mirror to a self someone hasn't yet claimed? Or does it risk burdening them with an ideal they may never reach? The answer, perhaps, lies in intent and tone. When done with genuine warmth and without expectation, this reflection becomes an act of faith, not a test. It says, I see this in you, not because you've proven it, but because I trust you enough to imagine it. And that trust, once offered, has a ripple effect. Because belief is contagious. When someone truly believes in your potential, not as a performance to achieve, but as a possibility to explore, it awakens something dormant. It doesn't just change how you act, it changes how you think about yourself. And when that belief is expressed with quiet conviction, with amplified enthusiasm, it doesn't feel like pressure, it feels like permission. Which leads us to the next layer of this psychological dance, how a slightly heightened expression of interest can turn ordinary moments into magnetic ones. Enthusiasm is magnetic, but only when it defies proportion. Not the kind that shouts or gushes, but the kind that leans in, eyes brightening just a fraction, voice dropping to a hush as if sharing a secret. That's fascinating, tell me more. This is amplified enthusiasm, not falsehood, but focus. It's the art of expressing slightly more interest in someone's idea, story, or presence than social norms might deem reasonable, yet doing so with such grounded sincerity that it never tips into performance. The magic lies not in volume, but in precision, the subtle lift of an eyebrow, the deliberate pause before responding, the way you let their words hang in the air as if they deserve reverence. In that calibrated intensity, you send a quiet, unmistakable signal. What you've just shared matters. You matter. At its core, amplified enthusiasm works because it speaks directly to a deep human hunger, to be seen, not just heard. When you respond to someone's offhand comment about a book they read or a problem they solved with genuine, slightly elevated curiosity, their brain registers it as validation. Neurochemically, this triggers a release of dopamine, the same reward chemical activated by food, touch, or achievement. In that moment, conversing with you becomes not just pleasant, but pleasurable. And because the brain seeks to repeat rewarding experiences, they'll be drawn back to you, eager to share again, to recreate that feeling of being truly valued. This isn't manipulation, it's emotional attunement turned up just one notch. The key is authenticity in the source of your interest, not its magnitude. You don't have to love their hobby, you simply have to care about their experience of it. But here's where it becomes truly mind-bending. amplified enthusiasm doesn't just change how the other person feels, it changes who they become. Enthusiasm, when consistently and sincerely directed towards someone's potential, ideas, or efforts, acts as a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you treat their thoughts as insightful, the more they begin to trust their own mind. The more you react to their stories as compelling, the more they see themselves as interesting. In reflecting back a version of them that is vibrant and worthy of attention, you help them step into that identity. Over time, your amplified response doesn't just mirror their value, it multiplies it. They grow into the space you've created with your attention. Yet this power is fragile. The line between amplification and artifice is thinner than it appears. If your enthusiasm feels rehearsed, exaggerated, or disconnected from the content of what they've shared, if you say "that's amazing" to a mundane detail with the same fervor you'd reserve for a breakthrough, it collapses into flattery, and flattery breeds suspicion. The brain is exquisitely tuned to detect incongruence. True amplified enthusiasm must be rooted in something real, however small, a genuine spark of curiosity, a moment of resonance, even just the human desire to understand another's world. The magic lives in that delicate gap, between sincerity and slight exaggeration, between what is and what could be felt. And for this enthusiasm to feel effortless, to flow without strain, it helps to have something deeper than admiration, it helps to have overlap. Not necessarily shared passions or beliefs, but shared moments, shared contexts, the quiet recognition of common ground. Because when you're already standing on the same patch of earth, your enthusiasm doesn't feel like a performance, it feels like natural resonance. And that's where the next layer of connection begins. Connection rarely arrives in thunderclaps or dramatic revelations. More often, it slips in through the quiet cracks of everyday life, through the shared glance at a rain-soaked bus stop, the mutual sigh in a too-long line, the recognition of a familiar face in an unexpected place. This is the heart of the overlap approach, the understanding that human bonds are not forged in grand declarations of kinship, but in the almost imperceptible moments where two lives brush against each other, however briefly. These are not profound revelations of shared values or life-altering experiences. They are micro-commonalities, the kind of small, seemingly trivial overlaps that, on the surface, mean nothing. You live in that neighborhood too? We both know Sarah from the design team. You also drink your coffee black? Yet, in their accumulation, they become something far more potent than coincidence. They become psychological glue. The power of the overlap approach lies in its alignment with one of psychology's most reliable phenomena, the mere exposure effect. First identified by social psychologist Robert Zajonc, this principle states that repeated exposure to a stimulus, whether a song, a symbol, or a person, increases our liking for it, even if we never consciously register the repetition. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort, in turn, breeds trust. When you gently highlight a shared detail, "I saw you at the farmer's market last weekend," you're not just exchanging information. You're activating this deep-seated cognitive bias. You're signaling, however subtly, we move in the same world. Our paths cross. We are not entirely strangers. And the brain, ever eager to reduce uncertainty, responds by softening its defenses. The other person begins to feel a quiet sense of kinship, not because of who you are, but because of where your lives intersect, even if that intersection is as thin as a shared subway line or a fondness for the same obscure podcast. What makes this approach so quietly effective is its humility. It doesn't demand vulnerability or require deep self-disclosure. It works precisely because it's low stakes. In a world saturated with curated personas and performative intimacy, the overlap approach offers something refreshingly simple: recognition without expectation. And in that simplicity lies its emotional resonance. There's a peculiar comfort in realizing you're not alone in your routines, your habits, your quiet corners of the world. It transforms the anonymous crowd into a web of potential connection. You begin to see yourself not as an isolated node, but as part of a larger, interwoven pattern. This is why, in moments of loneliness or dislocation, even the smallest overlap, a shared accent, a familiar brand on a stranger's bag, can feel like a lifeline. It whispers, "You belong here, too." But this also reveals a deeper, almost unsettling truth: we don't need to truly know someone to feel close to them. Proximity, real or imagined, is often enough. The brain is wired to equate familiarity with safety, and safety with affection. In an age of digital isolation and urban anonymity, this mechanism becomes even more pronounced. We crave signs that we're not adrift in a sea of strangers, and the overlap approach provides those signs in miniature. It turns chance into meaning, coincidence into connection. And while these bonds may be light, they are not meaningless. They are the first threads in the fabric of trust. Once that thread is in place, once a sense of shared space or rhythm has been established, something as simple as a sound can weave it tighter. Not a word, not a declaration, but a laugh. Not just any laugh, but one that lands in perfect, unspoken harmony. Because laughter, when timed just right, doesn't just express joy, it confirms belonging. And that brings us to the next subtle layer of human synchrony. Laughter is often mistaken for a simple expression of joy, but in truth, it is one of the oldest and most sophisticated tools of human connection. Long before language evolved to its current complexity, our ancestors used vocalizations, grunts, sighs, and yes, laughter, to signal safety, alliance, and shared understanding. Today, laughter still serves that primal function, but with far more nuance. It isn't merely a reaction to humor, it's social cement, binding people together in invisible threads of mutual recognition. And when placed with quiet precision, just a beat before or after someone else laughs, it can seal trust before logic even has a chance to intervene. This is strategic laughter, not performance, not flattery, but a subtle synchronization that whispers, "I'm with you." Strategic laughter operates on the principle of what neuroscientists call laughter contagion. When we hear someone laugh, our mirror neurons fire as if we were laughing ourselves. This automatic mimicry creates an immediate, subconscious sense of alignment. It's why a well-timed chuckle after someone's wry observation, "Yeah, my inbox is basically a black hole," can feel more affirming than any verbal praise. That small sound doesn't just acknowledge their words, it validates their perspective, their wit, their very way of seeing the world. It says, without a single syllable, "I not only heard you, I understood you." And in that moment of shared rhythm, a bridge forms. The other person feels seen not just for what they said, but for how they think. But laughter, for all its warmth, is a double-edged sword. Its power lies entirely in its timing and authenticity. Laugh too soon, before the punchline lands or the irony reveals itself, and you come across as eager, perhaps even desperate for approval. Laugh too late, and you seem disconnected, as if you're playing catch-up rather than participating. The sweet spot is a fraction of a second after their laughter begins, or even in the pause just before it ends, a gentle echo that feels responsive, not reactive. This requires attunement, not calculation. The most effective strategic laughter isn't planned, it's felt. It emerges from genuine amusement, but is allowed to surface with just enough awareness to serve connection. Those who master this rhythm, often without even realizing they're doing so, possess an almost unfair advantage. They don't need to dominate the conversation or dazzle with charisma. They simply modulate the emotional temperature of the room through sound, creating pockets of ease and intimacy wherever they go. What makes this especially potent is that laughter bypasses the critical mind. While words can be analyzed, debated, or doubted, a shared laugh operates below the threshold of scrutiny. It registers in the limbic system, the emotional core of the brain, long before the prefrontal cortex has a chance to question intent. In that gap, trust takes root. And because laughter is so deeply tied to vulnerability, to laugh is to momentarily let your guard down. Reciprocating it becomes an act of mutual surrender. You're not just sharing a joke, you're sharing a state of being. In the warmth created by this quiet synchrony, something remarkable becomes possible, the introduction of a frame so personal, so gently exclusive, that it feels less like influence and more like intimacy. When someone feels aligned with you, when they've laughed with you, not at you, they become receptive to a different kind of reflection. Not just of who they are, but of who they might be in your eyes alone. And that brings us to a frame so delicate, it borders on the sacred, the only you frame. What if you leaned in, lowered your voice just slightly, and said, "Most people wouldn't understand this, but you. I think you might." Watch closely. Their posture shifts. Their eyes focus. The ambient noise of the room seems to fade. In that instant, you haven't just shared an idea, you've conferred a rare kind of honor. This is the power of the only you frame, a quiet linguistic alchemy that transforms ordinary conversation into something intimate, almost sacred. It doesn't praise the person's achievements or charm, instead, it singles them out as uniquely equipped, by insight, temperament, or experience, to grasp something others would miss. And because it speaks directly to one of the deepest human longings, to be irreplaceable, it bypasses skepticism and lands straight in the heart. The only you frame works not through exaggeration, but through exclusivity. Human psychology is wired to value scarcity, and nothing feels more scarce than being the one person in a crowd who gets it. When you say, "I wouldn't share this with just anyone," but you seem like someone who'd see it clearly, you're not merely complimenting their intelligence, you're assigning them a role. You're placing them in a category of one. This triggers what behavioral scientists call the principle of exclusivity. We attach greater worth to things, and people, that are rare or selectively chosen. Unlike generic flattery, which can feel hollow or transactional, the only you frame feels personal because it implies discernment. It suggests you've looked around, considered others, and found only them worthy of this particular truth, this fragile idea, this unspoken worry. And in doing so, you awaken their sense of responsibility, not because you asked for help, but because you trusted them with something delicate. But here lies the quiet paradox at the heart of this frame. Everyone wants to be the only one, yet, with careful phrasing, nearly anyone can be made to feel that way. The same words that make your colleague feel uniquely insightful could, in another context, make a stranger on a train feel like the sole keeper of your confidence. This doesn't make the gesture false, it makes it human. After all, isn't it often true that in the moment of sharing, we do feel that this particular person is the right one to hear it? The frame simply gives voice to that fleeting intuition. And even if the uniqueness is situational rather than absolute, the emotional effect is real. The listener doesn't just feel flattered, they feel entrusted. And trust, once offered, tends to be returned in kind, often through generosity, attention, or loyalty that goes far beyond what a direct request could ever elicit. Yet this raises a gentle ethical question: is it honest to imply someone is the only one who understands, when you might say the same to others in different moments? Perhaps the answer lies not in literal truth, but in relational truth. In that specific exchange, at that precise emotional frequency, they are the only one you're choosing to confide in. And that act of choosing, however temporary, carries weight. It's less a deception and more a spotlight, momentarily illuminating a capacity in them that might otherwise remain hidden, even to themselves. Used with sincerity and care, the only you frame isn't manipulation, it's an invitation to step into a version of themselves that feels both rare and necessary. And once that sense of unique responsibility has been awakened, generosity often follows, not as obligation, but as natural response. But generosity, like trust, can be gently shaped. Not demanded outright, but invited through a subtle shift in expectation. This is where influence becomes artful, not forceful, where a quiet social nudge replaces a direct ask. And that brings us to the next layer of this psychological dance: polite pressure. Pressure doesn't always arrive with demands or deadlines. Sometimes, it comes wrapped in velvet, a quiet phrase, a softened tone, a pause that carries more weight than any command. It's the difference between "can you help me?" and "I wouldn't ask anyone else, but I'm really stuck." The words are gentle, almost deferential, yet they close a door so softly you barely hear it click. This is polite pressure, the art of making refusal feel less like a choice and more like a character flaw. It doesn't twist your arm, it simply reminds you, with exquisite courtesy, of the kind of person you believe yourself to be, and the kind of person you never want to appear to be. At its core, polite pressure leverages two of the most powerful forces in human social behavior: the norm of reciprocity and the aversion to social disapproval. When you frame a request as something you'd only make of someone you deeply respect, "I know you're busy, but if anyone could figure this out, it'd be you," you're not just asking for help. You're implying that saying no would contradict the very qualities you've just attributed to them. It's a subtle but potent bind. To refuse is to betray the image you've just held up as true. And because most of us are deeply invested in maintaining a consistent self-concept, especially one that includes kindness, reliability, or wisdom, we often say yes not out of desire, but out of identity preservation. The request is wrapped in such respect that declining feels less like setting a boundary and more like failing a test of character. What makes this approach so effective is its plausible deniability. There's no overt coercion, no guilt-tripping, no raised voice. The pressure exists entirely in the subtext, in the space between the words. And because it's delivered with humility, "I hate to bother you," or "only if it's not too much trouble," it disarms resistance. The other person can't accuse you of manipulation because, on the surface, you've given them every out. Yet the emotional architecture of the request leaves little room to maneuver. To say no would require not just declining a favor, but rejecting the role you've assigned them, the capable one, the generous one, the one who steps up when it matters. And few are willing to risk that internal, and often external, reputation shift. This reveals a quiet truth about human autonomy. Much of what we call free choice is shaped by invisible social contracts we've absorbed since childhood. We like to believe we act from pure volition, but in reality, our decisions are constantly filtered through layers of unspoken expectations about kindness, duty, fairness, and social harmony. Polite pressure doesn't create these pressures, it simply navigates them with precision. It understands that people don't just respond to what is asked of them, but to who they are asked to be in that moment. And so, we say yes, not because we have time, energy, or even willingness, but because we cannot bear to see ourselves as the kind of person who says no when someone they respect is counting on them. Of course, this dynamic carries ethical weight. Used with care and genuine regard, polite pressure can mobilize support in moments of real need, drawing out the best in people without diminishing their agency. But used cynically, it becomes emotional leverage disguised as humility. The line is thin, and it's drawn not in the words themselves, but in the intent behind them. When the goal is mutual care, the pressure feels like trust. When the goal is extraction, it feels like entrapment, even if the phrasing remains identical. And this leads us to an even more nuanced truth: kindness itself is rarely pure. Even the most generous acts often carry an undercurrent, subtle, unspoken, but present. Not cruelty, but conditionality. A quiet understanding that giving opens a door, and that door may one day need walking through. This is the nature of human exchange, and it finds its most elegant expression in what we might call conditional kindness. Kindness, in its idealized form, is given freely, without expectation, without ledger, without even the whisper of a return. But in the quiet reality of human relationships, kindness rarely exists in such pristine isolation. More often, it arrives wrapped in subtle context, carrying with it an unspoken understanding, a gentle implication that this gesture, however generous, exists within a web of mutual obligation. This is conditional kindness, not cruelty, not coercion, but strategy dressed in the soft fabric of goodwill. The strings are there, but they're woven so finely into the gift that they're felt, not seen. A pause after "I'm happy to cover your shift," followed by a knowing smile and the quiet addition, "I know you do the same for me," doesn't demand repayment. It simply reminds the recipient that they now occupy a role in a shared story of reciprocity. Conditional kindness operates on one of the most deeply ingrained social instincts, the reciprocity reflex. From early childhood, we're taught that receiving creates a quiet debt, a moral nudge to return the favor when the time comes. When someone offers help, praise, or support with even a hint of future alignment, "I stayed late to finish your report, I trust you'll have my back next quarter," the brain doesn't just register gratitude, it registers obligation. The condition isn't explicit, and that's what makes it so effective. It lives in the tone of voice, in the slight emphasis on you, in the way the eyes hold just a moment longer than usual. These microsignals bypass conscious resistance because they don't feel like demands, they feel like trust. And we are far more willing to fulfill an expectation framed as faith in our character than one framed as a transaction. But this raises a quiet ethical murmur: is this manipulation? The answer depends on your definition of purity in human connection. If you believe that true kindness must be utterly selfless, then yes, any implied condition taints it. But if you accept that all social bonds are, to some degree, systems of mutual care and exchange, then conditional kindness is simply honesty wrapped in grace. After all, even the most altruistic acts often carry an emotional return: the warmth of being needed, the satisfaction of contributing, the strengthening of a bond. The difference lies not in the presence of expectation, but in its delivery. The unfair advantage belongs to those who can extend generosity in a way that feels like pure gift, while still planting the seed of future reciprocity so gently that the recipient waters it themselves, believing it grew from their own soil. What makes this approach so psychologically potent is its alignment with how we construct identity. When someone offers us kindness with the quiet implication that we are the kind of person who reciprocates, we don't just feel grateful, we feel seen. And because we want to be that person, the reliable one, the fair one, the one who honors unspoken debts, we often go out of our way to fulfill the role, even when no one is watching. The condition becomes internalized, not imposed. In this light, conditional kindness isn't about control, it's about co-creating a shared understanding of how you move through the world together. Of course, the line between thoughtful reciprocity and emotional leverage is delicate. Cross it, and generosity becomes currency. Stay on the right side, and it becomes connection. The key is sincerity, the belief that the other person would, in fact, do the same, not because they owe you, but because it's who they are. And that belief, when communicated with warmth rather than calculation, transforms obligation into loyalty. Yet there's an even more powerful variation of this dynamic, one that flips the sequence entirely. Instead of tying kindness to a future act, what if you offer it first, with no immediate ask at all? What if you give before you need, creating a reservoir of goodwill that flows back to you when the moment arises? This is the essence of a deeper, more patient strategy, the generosity setup. There is an old adage that says, "Give before you ask," but its wisdom runs far deeper than mere etiquette. It speaks to a fundamental rhythm of human interaction, one governed not by logic, but by an almost instinctive aversion to imbalance. This is the heart of the generosity setup, the quiet, strategic act of offering something small, thoughtful, and unsolicited long before you have any need to request anything in return. It might be a handwritten note tucked into a colleague's bag, a book you remembered they mentioned months ago, or a piece of insight shared simply because it reminded you of them. The gesture itself need not be grand, its power lies in its timing and its tone. By giving first, without fanfare, without expectation, you plant a seed in the fertile soil of human reciprocity. And because our minds are wired to seek equilibrium and social exchange, that seed often grows into something far larger than the original gift. The generosity setup works because it bypasses the defenses that arise when a request comes out of the blue. When someone asks for a favor without prior connection, the brain scans for risk. What do they want? What's the catch? But when goodwill has already been extended, even in the smallest measure, the dynamic shifts. The recipient doesn't feel cornered, they feel entrusted. And more importantly, they feel a quiet, internal pressure to restore balance. Social psychologists have long documented this phenomenon. The norm of reciprocity is so deeply embedded in human culture that people will often go to disproportionate lengths to repay even minor kindnesses. A study once found that waiters who gave diners a single mint with their bills saw tips increase by 3%. When they gave 2 mints, tips rose by 20%. The gift was trivial, but the psychological effect was profound. We don't just appreciate generosity, we feel morally compelled to mirror it. But the true artistry of the generosity setup lies in its authenticity. The gift must feel personal, not performative. A generic thanks or a mass-forwarded email carries little weight. But a carefully chosen article that speaks to someone's current struggle, a compliment that notices something others overlook, or a small favor offered at just the right moment, these resonate because they signal genuine attention. They say, "I see you, and I care enough to act on it." That specificity transforms the gesture from transaction to connection. And because it arrives without strings, it feels like pure generosity, which only deepens the sense of obligation when the time comes to reciprocate. The recipient isn't repaying a debt, they're honoring a relationship. This reveals a beautiful, almost poetic flaw in human nature. We are deeply uncomfortable with asymmetry in kindness. We can tolerate imbalance in wealth, in status, even in love, but when someone gives us something freely, we feel an almost physical urge to restore harmony. It's not greed or guilt that drives this, it's dignity. To remain in debt, even a small one, feels like a failure of character. And so, when the moment arises, weeks or months later, when you finally do make a request, the other person doesn't just say yes. They often go further than asked, not out of duty, but out of a desire to finally close the loop, to stand once again on equal ground. Of course, this dynamic only works when the initial generosity is offered with sincerity. If the gift feels like a down payment, the spell breaks. But when it's rooted in real care, even if that care is quietly strategic, The reciprocity it inspires feels natural, even noble. And once that sense of mutual goodwill is established, you can deepen the connection further, not by asking for help, but by inviting their wisdom. Because there is no greater compliment than to ask someone for their advice. And in doing so, you place them in a role they rarely occupy, the trusted advisor. This is the subtle power of the next psychological turn. There is a quiet alchemy in the simple question, what would you do? On the surface, it appears to be an act of humility, a request for guidance from someone you respect. But beneath that modest phrasing lies a far more profound psychological shift. In asking for advice, you don't just gather perspectives, you create allies. The moment someone offers you their counsel, something subtle but irreversible happens in their mind. They become invested, not just in the problem, but in you. This isn't manipulation in the cynical sense, it's a natural consequence of how human identity intertwines with judgment. When someone tells you how to navigate a difficult conversation, manage a career crossroads, or handle a personal dilemma, they aren't merely sharing information. They are staking a piece of their self-image on the outcome. And that transforms them from observer to participant, from friend to stakeholder. This phenomenon is rooted in one of psychology's most enduring principles, cognitive dissonance. The theory, first articulated by Leon Festinger, suggests that we experience deep discomfort when our actions, beliefs, or self-perceptions are in conflict. Once someone gives you advice, especially thoughtful, personalized advice, their sense of competence and wisdom becomes tied to your success. If you thrive using their suggestion, their self-image as insightful and helpful is reinforced. But if you fail, or worse, if you ignore their advice entirely, they face an uncomfortable choice: either admit their judgment was flawed, or double down on believing you didn't follow it correctly. Most people, unconsciously, choose the latter. They begin to root for you, not just out of kindness, but to protect their own internal narrative. In this way, the act of advising becomes a silent pact. Your success becomes, in part, their validation. What makes this dynamic so mind-bending is that the connection deepens regardless of whether you actually follow their advice. Simply by asking, you've honored their perspective. You've signaled that their mind matters to you. And in a world where most people crave to be seen as valuable, not just liked, but needed, this is a rare and potent form of recognition. The advisor doesn't just feel useful, they feel trusted. And trust, once given in the form of a question, tends to bloom into loyalty. They'll remember that moment. They'll check in on you later. They'll offer more help, not because you asked again, but because they now have a quiet emotional stake in your story. It's as if, by handing them a piece of your dilemma, you've woven them into the fabric of your journey. Of course, this only works when the question is asked with genuine openness, not as a rhetorical device or a disguised pitch. The magic evaporates if the other person senses you're merely seeking validation for a decision you've already made. But when the inquiry is sincere, even tentative, it creates a space of shared vulnerability. You're not just solving a problem, you're building a bridge. And the beauty of this bridge is that it requires so little from you, just the humility to ask. Yet once that loyalty has taken root, it can be gently nurtured, not through demands, but through subtle reminders of the support already given. A quiet reference to their past kindness, a soft echo of their earlier advice, these don't accuse or pressure. They simply reactivate the emotional thread that was already there. And in doing so, they reinforce a bond that feels less like obligation and more like continuity. This is the art of the next psychological layer, not guilt as punishment, but guilt as gentle recall. Not shame, but a subtle loop. Guilt is often imagined as a heavy, thunderous emotion, shame shouted from the rooftops, remorse that crashes like a wave. But in the quiet corridors of human interaction, guilt rarely arrives with fanfare. More often, it slips in as a whisper, a faint echo from the past. I remember how you were there for me last winter, or you've always been the one I could count on. These phrases carry no blame, no demand, no overt reproach. Yet they resonate with a quiet power that can move someone to act more effectively than any direct plea. This is the essence of subtle guilt loops, not manipulation in the cruel sense, but a gentle activation of memory that stirs the conscience without bruising the ego. It's not about making someone feel bad, it's about reminding them of who they once chose to be, and inviting them to step back into that role. Subtle guilt loops operate on a profound truth about identity. We are deeply loyal to our past selves. When someone recalls a moment of your generosity, "You stayed late to help me finish that project," they aren't just referencing an event. They're holding up a mirror to a version of you that acted with kindness, reliability, or courage. And because we strive for internal consistency, we feel a quiet pressure to align our present behavior with that past image. To refuse help now would create a dissonance. Am I still the kind of person who shows up? The loop doesn't accuse, it simply evokes. And in that evocation, it awakens a sense of continuity. The listener doesn't feel manipulated, they feel recognized. And in that recognition, they often choose to act, not out of obligation to you, but out of fidelity to themselves. What makes this approach so ethically nuanced is its reliance on truth. The memory invoked is real. The kindness did happen. The loop doesn't fabricate debt, it illuminates an existing thread in the tapestry of your relationship. There's no exaggeration, no invented sacrifice, just a soft spotlight on a moment when they chose to be their best self. And because that moment was genuine, the resulting sense of responsibility feels equally authentic. This is why subtle guilt loops, when used with care, don't breed resentment. They feel less like leverage and more like trust. I believe you'll act the way you did before, because that's who you are. Yet this raises a quiet question: is it fair to use memory as a form of gentle persuasion? After all, people change. Circumstances shift. The person who had time and energy to help last year may be stretched thin today. To invoke their past generosity could feel like an unfair burden, especially if they're already overwhelmed. The ethical line lies in tone and timing. A subtle guilt loop offered with warmth, humility, and awareness. I know you've got a lot on your plate, but I couldn't help remembering how you helped me through something similar, honors their current reality while still honoring their past character. But if it's delivered with expectation or passive aggression, it collapses into emotional pressure. The difference isn't in the words, but in the space between them, the breath that says, "I understand if you can't," even as you remind them of who they've been. Ultimately, subtle guilt loops reveal how deeply our sense of self is woven into our relationships. We don't just remember what others have done for us, we remember what we've done for them, and we carry that identity forward like a quiet promise. And sometimes, all it takes is a gentle echo to bring that promise back to life. But there are moments when revisiting the past isn't enough, when the situation feels too heavy, too charged, too stuck in its current frame. In those cases, the most powerful move isn't to appeal to memory, but to shift perspective entirely. Sometimes, the best way to move forward is to change the frame altogether. This is the quiet art of the reframe shift. A problem is rarely solved by attacking it head-on. More often, it dissolves the moment you step outside its boundaries and look at it from a different angle. This is the quiet power of the reframe shift, not a denial of reality, but a reorientation of perspective that changes everything. Consider the difference between "you're late again" and "I'm glad you made it, must have been a rough day." The facts remain unchanged, time was missed, schedules disrupted, but the emotional landscape shifts entirely. In the first frame, the message is accusation. In the second, it's empathy. And in that shift, defensiveness melts, walls lower, and connection becomes possible again. The reframe shift doesn't alter what happened, it alters what it means. At its core, this technique works because human perception is not a mirror of reality, but a lens shaped by language, context, and expectation. The same event can be experienced as a failure or a learning opportunity, a betrayal or a misunderstanding, a cost or an investment, depending entirely on how it's framed. In negotiation, calling a price an investment rather than an expense doesn't change the number, but it changes the buyer's relationship to it. In conflict, describing someone's outburst as they're under a lot of pressure instead of they're being rude doesn't excuse the behavior, but it makes it human, and therefore addressable. The frame determines whether we see a threat or a signal, a dead end or a detour. And because our emotions follow our interpretations, changing the frame changes the feeling. What makes the reframe shift so potent is that it operates below the threshold of argument. You don't have to convince someone they're wrong, you simply offer a new way to be right. When a colleague snaps during a meeting, saying you seem really stressed, everything okay, doesn't challenge their anger, it recontextualizes it as a symptom, not a stance. This bypasses the need for them to defend their behavior, because you're no longer labeling it as misbehavior at all. You've moved the conversation from judgment to understanding, from blame to curiosity. And in that space, resolution often finds its own path. But the implications run deeper than interpersonal harmony. The reframe shift reveals a startling truth: reality itself is malleable through language. Two people can stand side by side, witness the exact same event, and walk away living in entirely different worlds, not because they saw different things, but because they framed them differently. One sees rejection, the other sees redirection. One sees chaos, the other sees opportunity. And because we act based on our perceived reality, not objective reality, the frame doesn't just shape how we feel, it shapes what we do. This is why those who master the art of reframing often wield quiet influence. They don't argue with the story, they rewrite its opening line. Who controls the frame controls the story, and, by extension, the outcome. Of course, this power carries responsibility. A reframe can heal or harm, clarify or distort, depending on intent. Used with compassion, it creates space for growth. Used cynically, it can gaslight or evade accountability. The ethical line lies in whether the new frame expands understanding or contracts it. Does it bring more truth into focus, or obscure it under a prettier label? When done well, the reframe shift doesn't deny pain, it dignifies it by placing it in a larger context. And once a moment has passed, once the immediate emotions have settled, the frame doesn't disappear. It lingers, in memory. Because how we recall an event is shaped not just by what happened, but by how it was interpreted in the aftermath. And that opens the door to an even more subtle influence, the gentle editing of memory itself. For stories, once told, can be retold, and in the retelling, reshaped. This is the domain of redirected memory. Copy Ask Explain Translate, ENUS, Image Edit Web Dev Image Generation V. Memory is often imagined as a vault, a faithful archive where moments are stored intact, waiting to be replayed exactly as they happened. But neuroscience tells a different story. Memories are not recordings, they are reconstructions. Every time we recall an event, we rebuild it from fragments, colored by our current emotions, beliefs, and the language used to describe it. And because this reconstruction is fluid, it can be gently guided. This is the essence of redirected memory, not erasing the past, but subtly reshaping how someone remembers it by highlighting certain details over others. After a difficult conversation, instead of saying, "That was rough," you might offer, "It's impressive how calmly you held your ground in that pressure." You haven't changed what occurred, but you've shifted the emotional anchor of the memory. Over time, that anchor takes root, and the person begins to recall the event not as a moment of stress, but as one of quiet strength. Redirected memory works because the brain prioritizes emotional salience over factual precision. When we repeatedly hear, or tell ourselves, a particular interpretation of an event, that version becomes dominant. The amygdala tags memories with emotional significance, and the more a story is framed in terms of resilience, insight, or grace, the more those qualities become woven into the fabric of the recollection itself. This isn't deception, it's narrative sculpting. By emphasizing composure instead of chaos, agency instead of helplessness, you're not denying the difficulty, they lived it, but you're offering a lens through which to view it that fosters self-respect rather than regret. And because people tend to internalize the stories others reflect back to them, especially from trusted voices, this redirection can become a quiet form of psychological repair. But this power walks a delicate ethical line. On one side lies healing, on the other, distortion. Is it honest to reframe a moment of panic as one of poise? The answer depends not on the facts alone, but on the intent and the effect. If the goal is to soothe shame, restore dignity, or help someone see their own capacity in hindsight, then redirected memory can be an act of profound kindness. It allows people to carry their past without being crushed by it. But if the goal is to obscure accountability, rewrite history for convenience, or manufacture a false narrative, then it crosses into manipulation. The distinction lies in whether the new frame expands the person's sense of self, or constricts it. Does it help them integrate the experience with greater wholeness, or does it sever them from an important truth? What makes this technique especially potent is its subtlety. It doesn't require argument or correction. It simply offers an alternative emphasis, a single sentence that lingers long after the conversation ends. I was struck by how thoughtfully you listened, even when things got heated. You turned a real setback into a learning moment. These aren't grand declarations, they're quiet seeds planted in the soil of memory. And because memory is reconstructive, each time the event is recalled, those seeds grow a little more, gradually shifting the emotional terrain. The person may still remember the tension, the uncertainty, the discomfort, but now it's framed within a larger story of competence, not collapse. In a world where so many carry memories that wound rather than teach, redirected memory offers a gentle form of alchemy, turning pain into perspective, not by denying it, but by dignifying it. It reminds us that while we cannot change the past, we can influence how it lives within us, and how it shapes our future. Yet there are moments when the best response to pain, our own or another's, is not to reframe it at all, but to contain it. To draw a soft boundary around it and say, with quiet finality, it's fine. Not because it is, but because some wounds don't need analysis, they need space. And that brings us to a different kind of psychological shield, the "it's fine" barrier. Saying it's fine is rarely about the thing itself. More often, it's a quiet declaration of boundaries, a soft but firm line drawn in the sand of a conversation. On the surface, the phrase sounds dismissive, even passive. But when delivered with calm certainty, without a trace of bitterness or defensiveness, it becomes something far more potent, a psychological barrier. It doesn't shout stop, it whispers this is closed. And because it arrives wrapped in serenity rather than anger, it disarms the other person completely. There's no drama to latch onto, no emotional hook to pull at. Just stillness. And in that stillness, the conversation loses its momentum. The "it's fine" barrier isn't evasion, it's containment. It says, without accusation or explanation, I've processed this. I don't need to revisit it with you. This technique works precisely because it subverts expectation. In most conflicts or moments of tension, people anticipate resistance, anger, tears, justification. Those reactions, however understandable, invite further engagement. They signal that the wound is still open, that the topic is negotiable. But calm dismissal? It offers no foothold. When someone responds to an apology, a probing question, or even a guilt-laden remark with a quiet "it's fine," they remove the emotional fuel that keeps the interaction burning. The other person is left with nothing to argue against, because peace is not a position you can debate. You can't reason with tranquility. You can't guilt someone who refuses to perform hurt. And so, the conversation folds in on itself, not because the issue is resolved, but because one person has chosen not to let it define the space between them any longer. What makes the "it's fine" barrier so powerful is that it reveals a counterintuitive truth: passivity can be a form of control. By refusing to engage emotionally, by not defending, not explaining, not even acknowledging the weight of what's been said, you dictate the depth of the interaction. You decide what gets air, what gets energy, what gets to live in the shared space between you. This isn't coldness, it's curation. It's the quiet assertion that not every wound needs to be shown, not every slight needs to be dissected, not every apology needs to be accepted aloud. Sometimes, the most dignified response is to simply close the door and walk away, without slamming it. But this barrier only holds if it is seamless. Any crack, a sigh, a flicker of resentment in the eyes, a follow-up comment days later, invites the other person back in. Consistency is everything. The moment you waver, the moment you hint that it's not fine, the boundary dissolves. That's why the "it's fine" barrier demands inner resolve. It's not a tactic you deploy casually, it's a stance you embody. It requires you to have already done the internal work, processed the hurt, released the need for validation, so that your calm is genuine, not performative. When it's real, it radiates a kind of unshakable stillness that others instinctively respect. When it's feigned, it crumbles under the slightest pressure. Of course, this approach isn't appropriate for every situation. In relationships that require repair, honesty, or mutual vulnerability, shutting down can feel like abandonment. But in contexts where emotional entanglement serves no purpose, where the other person seeks drama, guilt, or control, the "it's fine" barrier becomes a shield of serenity. It protects your inner world without waging war in the outer one. And once you've mastered the art of setting such quiet boundaries, you begin to see that expectations themselves can be fluid. Not just your own, but those others place upon you. Because if a phrase as simple as "it's fine" can redefine a conversation, then perhaps identity, too, need not be fixed. Sometimes, the most liberating move is to blur the lines of who people think you are, until they no longer know what to expect. This is the subtle art of expectation blurring. There is a quiet prison we all inhabit, one built not of walls, but of expectations. From the moment we enter any social circle, workplace, or relationship, people begin to assign us roles: the reliable one, the joker, the skeptic, the peacemaker. Over time, these labels harden into identities, and we, often unconsciously, begin to perform them. We laugh when we're expected to laugh, stay silent when we're expected to stay silent, even suppress parts of ourselves that don't fit the narrative others have written for us. But what if you gently disrupted that script? What if, just once, you responded with unexpected seriousness when everyone anticipated a joke, or offered generosity when you were known for detachment? This is the essence of expectation blurring, the deliberate, subtle act of stepping outside your established persona, not to confuse, but to liberate, both yourself and the way others see you. Expectation blurring doesn't require grand reinvention. It thrives in the small, almost imperceptible deviations. The usually stoic colleague who shares a vulnerable memory over coffee, the perpetual optimist who, for once, names a hard truth without softening it, the quiet friend who suddenly offers a bold, unconventional idea in a meeting. These moments don't reject your core identity, they expand it. And in doing so, they create a ripple of intrigue. When people can't quite predict your next move, they pay closer attention. You become less a fixed character in their mental story and more a living, evolving presence. This unpredictability isn't chaos, it's dimensionality. It signals that you are not reducible to a single trait or role, that you contain multitudes, as Whitman once wrote, and refuse to be flattened by convenience. But the true power of expectation blurring lies not just in how it affects others, but in how it frees you. We are not only confined by the expectations of those around us, we internalize them. We begin to believe we are only the funny one, the dependable one, the logical one. And in that belief, we silence other parts of ourselves, deeming them out of character. Blurring those lines, even slightly, is an act of self-reclamation. It reminds you, and the world, that you are not a statue, but a river, constantly moving, reshaping, revealing new banks with time. The moment you allow yourself to be surprising, you reclaim agency over your own narrative. You stop asking, "What would people expect me to do?" and start asking, "What feels true right now?" Yet this liberation comes with a quiet cost, the courage to disappoint. Because every time you step outside your assigned role, someone will feel unsettled. The friend who relies on your humor may feel adrift when you're contemplative. The team that counts on your calm may panic when you express frustration. Expectations, after all, are a form of emotional scaffolding. They help people navigate relationships with predictability. When you remove a piece of that scaffold, even gently, it can feel like betrayal. But the discomfort is temporary and necessary. True connection isn't built on performance, but on authenticity. And authenticity requires the freedom to be inconsistent, to evolve, to contradict yourself from time to time. As the poet John Keats once described negative capability, the ability to dwell in uncertainty without reaching for fixed identity, so too must we allow ourselves the space to be unknowable, even to those who think they know us best. Of course, expectation blurring must be done with care. Too much unpredictability too quickly can feel erratic, even destabilizing. The key is subtlety, a single unexpected gesture, a shift in tone, a moment of uncharacteristic candor. It's not about rejecting your essence, but refusing to be imprisoned by it. And when done with grace, it doesn't alienate, it deepens curiosity. People begin to wonder, who are you, really? And in that wondering, they see you not as a function, but as a person. Once you've created that space of openness, once you've shown that you cannot be neatly categorized, perception becomes malleable. And in that malleability lies opportunity. Because now, when you offer praise, it doesn't land as generic flattery. It lands as a precise, intentional signal. You're no longer bound by the old script, so your words carry new weight. And that brings us to a form of influence that is as accurate as it is powerful, targeted praise. Praise is often given like confetti, scattered broadly, brightly, and without much thought. Great job! You're amazing! So impressive! These phrases sound kind, even encouraging, but they vanish almost as soon as they're spoken. They lack texture, specificity, and weight. They feel less like genuine recognition and more like social lubricant, polite noise that fills the air but leaves no mark. But there is another kind of praise, quieter, more deliberate, and far more potent. This is targeted praise, The art of noticing not just what someone did, but how they did it, and reflecting that back with precision. The way you paused before answering showed real thoughtfulness. I admired how you redirected the conversation when it started to spiral. You asked a question no one else saw, and it changed everything. These aren't compliments tossed into the void, they are mirrors held up to moments of quiet excellence, and in their specificity, they become transformative. Targeted praise works because it proves you were truly present. Generic praise can be delivered without paying attention. You could say you're so smart to anyone, at any time. But to name the exact gesture, the precise choice, the subtle inflection that made a difference, that requires observation. It requires care. And because it demonstrates genuine attention, it feels earned, not obligatory. The recipient doesn't just hear approval, they feel seen. And to be seen in a world of surface-level interactions is a rare and nourishing gift. This kind of praise doesn't inflate the ego, it affirms the self. It says, I noticed not just your outcome, but your process, and your intention mattered. But the implications of targeted praise extend far beyond momentary validation. Human behavior is shaped, often unconsciously, by what is reinforced. Psychologists have long known that people repeat what gets noticed, especially when that notice is positive and specific. When you highlight a particular behavior, the way you included everyone's input made the team feel valued. You're not just acknowledging the past, you're quietly shaping the future. The person is far more likely to repeat that behavior, not because they were told to, but because they now understand its impact. They've been given a map of their own effectiveness. And because the praise is tied to action rather than identity, you're thoughtful versus you acted thoughtfully, it avoids the trap of fixed labels. It encourages growth, not performance. This makes targeted praise one of the most elegant forms of influence, because it guides without commanding. There's no instruction, no critique, no implied you should do this more. Just a clear, appreciative spotlight on a moment that worked. And in that light, the person internalizes the lesson themselves. They don't feel managed, they feel understood. Over time, these small acknowledgments accumulate into a kind of behavioral compass, helping someone navigate their own choices with greater awareness and intention. A manager who consistently praises specific acts of collaboration will cultivate a more cohesive team. A friend who notices moments of courage will nurture resilience in their loved one. The power isn't in the words alone, but in the attention behind them. Of course, this requires patience and presence. Targeted praise cannot be faked or rushed. It demands that you slow down enough to truly witness another person, to catch the micro moments of grace, insight, or restraint that others might miss. And because it's rooted in authenticity, it builds trust far more effectively than effusive but vague admiration ever could. Yet even the most consistent among us occasionally slip. We say something uncharacteristic, act out of alignment with our values, or fall into old patterns we thought we'd outgrown. In those moments, correction doesn't need to come as criticism. Sometimes, the gentlest and most effective way to reset someone is not to point out what they did wrong, but to remind them of who they usually are. This is the quiet power of the next psychological cue. There is a profound difference between saying that was rude and that's not like you. On the surface, both address the same behavior, but one attacks the action, while the other questions the alignment between that action and the person's core identity. The first labels, the second invites. The "that's not like you" cue is not a rebuke, it's a gentle realignment. It doesn't say, "you are bad," but rather, "this moment doesn't reflect who I know you to be." In doing so, it sidesteps defensiveness entirely. Because when you challenge someone's behavior as inconsistent with their character, you're not diminishing them, you're reaffirming the better version of themselves they already believe in. And that makes correction feel less like punishment and more like a homecoming. This approach works because human beings are fiercely protective of their self-concept. We may tolerate criticism of our actions, but we resist, often unconsciously, any threat to our identity. Call someone lazy, and they'll list every productive thing they've ever done. Call them dishonest, and they'll recount moments of integrity. But suggest that a recent choice doesn't fit the person they see themselves as. That lands differently. It creates a quiet dissonance. If I'm the kind of person who is kind, thoughtful, fair, then why did I just act otherwise? Rather than doubling down to defend their ego, they're more likely to reflect, recalibrate, and even apologize, not to you, but to themselves. They'll seek to restore internal consistency, to prove that your perception of them was correct all along. In essence, you haven't shamed them into change, you've trusted them back into alignment. The elegance of this cue lies in its implicit faith. It assumes the best, even in the face of a misstep. It says, I know you're having an off moment, but I still see the person beneath it. This is especially powerful in close relationships, where identity is deeply intertwined with how we're perceived by those we care about. A partner who says, that's not like you, usually you're the first to listen, doesn't just point out a lapse, they hold up a mirror to the person's better nature. And because that nature is already part of their self-image, they're motivated not by guilt, but by a desire to live up to the version of themselves you've just reflected back. Of course, this only works if the statement is rooted in truth. If someone has a pattern of the very behavior you're calling unlike them, the phrase rings hollow. Worse, it can feel like gaslighting. But when used authentically, in response to a genuine deviation from someone's usual character, it becomes a form of compassionate accountability. It acknowledges the stumble without defining the person by it. And in a world where criticism often feels like condemnation, this distinction is everything. What's more, that's not like you cue preserves dignity on both sides. The speaker avoids the moral high ground of judgment, the listener avoids the shame of being labeled. Instead, you meet in a shared space of mutual respect, where growth is possible not because someone was wrong, but because they are capable of being right again. Yet sometimes, the most powerful response to a misstep isn't words at all, but the deliberate absence of them. A well-placed silence can convey more than any sentence, disappointment, reflection, or simply the weight of what's just been said. In that quiet space, the other person is left alone with their thoughts, and often, that's where real change begins. Because silence doesn't argue, it invites introspection. And that brings us to a force as old as conversation itself, the pause power. In the rush of conversation, we often treat silence as a flaw, an awkward gap to be patched over with filler words, nervous laughter, or hasty reassurances. But in truth, silence is not emptiness. It is space, charged, deliberate, and fertile. The pause power is the art of leaning into that space, of allowing a few extra seconds of quiet after a statement or question, not out of hesitation, but as a strategic invitation. Most people are so conditioned to avoid silence that they will instinctively rush to fill it, often revealing more than they intended, backtracking on a position, or even conceding a point they hadn't planned to yield. In that suspended moment, the balance of the interaction shifts. You are no longer chasing answers, you are creating the conditions in which they emerge on their own. The mechanics of the pause power are deceptively simple. After someone speaks, especially when they've just offered a partial truth, a vague answer, or a defensive stance, you say nothing. You hold your gaze gently, offer a slight nod, and wait. Your silence isn't cold or judgmental, it's patient, expectant. And because human beings are wired for reciprocity in dialogue, that pause becomes a quiet pressure. The other person feels the weight of the unspoken question, is that all? And more often than not, they respond, not to you, but to their own discomfort with the void. They elaborate. They clarify. They backtrack. Sometimes, they even confess. A manager might ask, how's the project coming, and receive the rote reply, good. But if they simply wait, 3, 4, 5 seconds, the employee often adds, "Well, we're a bit behind, actually," or "I'm worried about the timeline." The pause didn't extract the truth, it created the safety for it to surface. What makes this technique so potent is that it bypasses resistance entirely. When you press someone with follow-up questions, you trigger defensiveness. But silence offers no target. There's nothing to argue against, no accusation to deflect. Instead, the other person is left alone with their own thoughts, and in that solitude, honesty often finds its voice. The pause power doesn't manipulate, it creates a vacuum that the other person fills with their own unfiltered reality. And because the revelation comes from within, they feel ownership over it, not coercion. They don't feel cornered, they feel heard, even though you haven't said a word. This reveals a deeper truth about influence. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. In a world obsessed with persuasion through words, through clever arguments, emotional appeals, or strategic framing, silence stands apart as a form of anti-influence. It doesn't push, it pulls. It doesn't lead, it allows. And in that allowing, it grants the other person the dignity of self-disclosure. The pause becomes a mirror, not of your expectations, but of their own inner landscape. They see themselves more clearly in the quiet, and often, that's enough to shift their stance. Of course, mastering the pause power requires emotional discipline. It means resisting the urge to rescue the conversation, to smooth over discomfort, or to prove your own engagement through constant verbal feedback. It means being comfortable with ambiguity, with tension, with the possibility that the silence might stretch longer than feels polite. But those who cultivate this comfort wield a quiet authority. Their silence isn't passive, it's intentional. It says, "I trust you to finish your thought. I trust the process. I don't need to control the outcome." And when that silence is broken, not by you, but by them, it often leads to a moment of unexpected vulnerability. In that opening, the connection deepens. But to truly meet them there, you must go beyond acknowledging their words. You must reflect back the emotion beneath them, the unspoken fear, hope, or frustration that gave rise to the confession. Because understanding isn't just about hearing what someone says, it's about recognizing how they feel. And that brings us to a form of attunement so subtle, it feels like empathy made audible, emotional mirroring. In the landscape of human connection, few gestures are as disarming as being truly understood, not just heard, but felt. We often mistake listening for waiting to speak, or problem-solving for caring. But the deepest form of validation doesn't come from fixing someone's issue or even agreeing with their perspective. It comes from reflecting back the emotional current running beneath their words. This is the essence of emotional mirroring, not repeating what someone says, but naming what they feel. "You sound overwhelmed. That must have been really disappointing. I can hear how much this matters to you." These simple phrases do not offer solutions, they offer recognition. And in that recognition, something profound happens, walls dissolve, defenses soften, and trust takes root. Emotional mirroring works because it speaks directly to a primal human need, to be seen in our full emotional reality. When someone articulates the feeling we've been struggling to name ourselves, it creates a moment of resonance so powerful it can feel like relief. It's as if a fog has lifted, not because the problem is gone, but because we're no longer alone in it. Neuroscience supports this. When our emotions are accurately labeled by another, it activates regions of the brain associated with regulation and safety, actually reducing the intensity of distress. This is why saying you seem frustrated can calm someone more effectively than offering 10 pieces of advice. You're not trying to change their experience, you're honoring it. And in that honoring, you communicate something essential: your inner world matters to me. What makes this approach so transformative is that it separates understanding from agreement. You don't have to endorse someone's actions or beliefs to validate their feelings. A friend might be angry about a decision you support, but you can still say, "I can see how hurt you are by this," and in doing so, preserve the connection even amid disagreement. Emotional mirroring creates a bridge where logic often builds walls. It says, "I may not see it your way, but I see you." And in a world where so many conversations devolve into debates over who's right, this distinction is revolutionary. People don't need to be convinced, they need to be witnessed. Of course, the power of emotional mirroring depends entirely on accuracy and sincerity. A generic "you must be upset" can feel dismissive if it misses the mark. But when you tune in closely, reading tone, pace, body language, and subtext, and reflect back the precise emotional shade, you sound more resigned than angry. It lands with uncanny precision. This requires presence, not performance. It asks you to set aside your own agenda long enough to inhabit, however briefly, the emotional atmosphere of another person. And when you do, the effect is often immediate. Their shoulders drop, their voice softens, their eyes meet yours with a new kind of openness. They feel less like a problem to be solved and more like a person to be known. This reveals a quiet truth about influence: connection precedes change. No one is receptive to advice, feedback, or redirection when they feel misunderstood. But once they feel seen, truly, deeply seen, they become willing to listen, to consider, even to shift. Emotional mirroring doesn't manipulate, it prepares the ground. It turns a transactional exchange into a relational one. And in that space, everything becomes possible. Yet there is an art to timing, even in empathy. Sometimes, the most powerful response isn't immediate validation, but a brief suspension of reassurance. Because relief, when delayed just slightly, becomes more potent. When someone shares a worry and you don't rush to soothe it, to say "it'll be fine," but instead let the weight of it hang in the air for a moment, the eventual comfort feels earned, not automatic. That pause honors the gravity of their emotion. And when reassurance finally comes, it lands not as denial, but as hope. This is the subtle rhythm of delayed relief. There is a quiet alchemy in the way we deliver comfort. Most of us, when faced with someone in distress, rush to soothe, to say it's okay, before the worry has even fully left their lips. We do this out of kindness, out of empathy, out of a genuine desire to ease their pain. But in our haste, we often rob the reassurance of its full power. Because relief, like any emotional experience, gains depth and resonance when it is preceded by tension. This is the principle behind delayed relief, the intentional, gentle withholding of reassurance just long enough to let the weight of concern settle, so that when comfort finally arrives, it doesn't just land, it soars. Instead of an immediate "don't worry," you offer a thoughtful pause, a soft look, and then, with quiet conviction, "Actually, it's going to be fine." That small suspension transforms reassurance from a reflex into a gift. Delayed relief works because it honors the emotional reality of the moment. When someone shares a fear or a problem, they are not just seeking a solution, they are seeking validation that the problem matters. If you dismiss it too quickly, even with good intentions, it can feel as though you're minimizing their experience. But if you allow a beat of silence, long enough for them to feel heard in their anxiety, long enough for the gravity of their concern to be acknowledged, then your reassurance carries far more weight. It doesn't deny the difficulty, it transcends it. The pause says, "Yes, this is real. Yes, it's heavy. And yet, there is still hope." That sequence, acknowledgement followed by resolution, creates a narrative arc within the interaction, however brief. And narratives, especially emotional ones, are what the human mind clings to. This technique draws its power from a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as the peak-end rule. First identified by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, this principle states that we don't remember experiences as a sum of their parts, but rather by their emotional peaks and how they end. A conversation filled with tension that resolves into calm will be remembered more positively than one that was uniformly pleasant but uneventful. By allowing a moment of suspended uncertainty, by letting the peak of concern rise just slightly before offering relief, you shape not only the present interaction but the memory of it. The person doesn't just feel better in the moment, they walk away with a story in which they were seen in their worry and then gently guided toward peace. And that story becomes part of how they see you, not just as someone who offers comfort, but as someone who understands the rhythm of healing. Of course, delayed relief must be handled with care. The pause cannot be so long that it breeds despair, nor so theatrical that it feels manipulative. It should feel natural, a breath, a thoughtful glance, a moment of shared gravity, not a calculated performance. The goal is not to prolong suffering, but to deepen the impact of solace. When done with sincerity, this slight delay communicates something profound. I take your fear seriously enough not to rush past it. And in that seriousness, trust is built. What's more, delayed relief subtly shifts the dynamic from rescue to partnership. You're not swooping in to fix, you're walking alongside, letting the emotion breathe before offering a hand up. This fosters resilience, not dependence. The person learns that discomfort is survivable, and that relief, when it comes, is all the sweeter for having been waited for. And in that space between tension and release, something else becomes possible: authenticity. Because once someone feels safe in their vulnerability, once they've been allowed to express fear without immediate correction, they become more open to sharing even deeper truths. They realize that you don't need them to be okay to care for them. And that safety is the fertile ground in which true connection grows. For vulnerability, when offered without armor, is not weakness, it is the ultimate hook. It invites others not just to listen, but to lean in, to reciprocate, to reveal their own hidden corners. This is the quiet magnetism of the vulnerability hook. There is a paradox at the heart of human connection: the more we try to appear strong, the more distant we become. Perfection, for all its allure, is isolating. It creates pedestals, not bridges. But share a flaw, just one small, human imperfection, and something remarkable happens. Walls that seemed impenetrable begin to soften. Eyes meet with less scrutiny and more warmth. The air between you grows lighter, more breathable. This is the quiet power of the vulnerability hook, the deliberate, gentle disclosure of a minor insecurity, mistake, or uncertainty, not as a cry for help, but as an invitation to mutual humanity. I was so nervous before that presentation, I almost backed out. I still second-guess my decisions all the time. Honestly, I have no idea what I'm doing half the time. These aren't confessions of failure, they are signals of shared fragility. And in a world where so many wear masks of competence, such honesty is disarming. The vulnerability hook works because it triggers a deep psychological reflex: reciprocal disclosure. When one person offers a piece of their inner world, especially one that reveals doubt or imperfection, it creates a subtle but powerful social contract. The other person feels not only permission but a quiet compulsion to respond in kind. This isn't manipulation in the cynical sense, it's emotional reciprocity in its most natural form. By revealing your own stumble, you signal that this space is safe for stumbles. You remove the unspoken pressure to perform, to be polished, to have it all together. And in that relief, others often exhale and share something real. A colleague might admit they've been struggling with burnout. A friend might confess they feel lost in their relationship. The exchange isn't transactional, it's transformative. What began as a simple admission becomes a moment of genuine connection. But the key lies in calibration. The vulnerability must be minor enough to feel relatable, not overwhelming. Oversharing too soon can burden the other person, shifting the dynamic from mutual exchange to emotional dumping. The goal isn't to unburden yourself, but to create a shared sense of normalcy around imperfection. The most effective vulnerability hooks are specific, light, and tinged with self-awareness, not self-pity. I totally blanked on my client's name today. Mortifying, carries more connection than a vague "I'm such a mess." It's human, humorous, and humble, all at once. And because it's framed without expectation, it invites response without demanding it. What makes this approach so potent is that it reframes influence as intimacy. Strength impresses, but imperfection connects. When you reveal a small flaw, you don't diminish your credibility, you deepen your relatability. People don't follow those who seem untouchable, they follow those who feel real. And in that realness, trust flourishes. Influence, then, ceases to feel like persuasion and begins to feel like partnership. You're no longer trying to convince someone of your worth, you're inviting them into a shared space where worth isn't performative, but inherent. This reveals a deeper truth about human nature. We are drawn not to those who have it all figured out, but to those who are brave enough to admit they don't. In a culture that glorifies confidence and certainty, vulnerability becomes a quiet act of rebellion, and of generosity. It says, "You don't have to be perfect here. Neither am I." And in that permission, people relax. They open up. They engage more fully. The vulnerability hook doesn't just build rapport, it cultivates psychological safety, the very foundation of collaboration, creativity, and care. Of course, this requires courage. To be vulnerable is to risk judgment, rejection, or dismissal. But the paradox is that the very act of risking imperfection often earns more respect than flawless performance ever could. It signals emotional maturity, self-awareness, and authenticity, qualities far more enduring than surface-level competence. Yet even vulnerability must be balanced with presence. Too much self-disclosure, too often, can dilute its power, or worse, shift the focus entirely onto you. Influence isn't about how much you reveal, but how well you create space for others to do the same. And that brings us to a delicate companion of vulnerability, charm. But charm, like vulnerability, is a substance that must be dosed with precision. Too little, and you seem distant; too much, and you seem insincere. This is the tightrope of overloaded charm. Charm is a delicate currency, valuable when spent sparingly, suspicious when lavished without restraint. We've all encountered it, the person whose compliments arrive too quickly, whose attention feels almost theatrical, whose warmth seems turned up to an unnatural brightness. At first, it's flattering. But soon, a quiet unease creeps in. Something feels off, not because the words are false, but because their intensity outpaces the context. This is the phenomenon of overloaded charm, the strategic, temporary amplification of likability through excessive praise, unwavering eye contact, or effusive enthusiasm. On its own, such behavior can feel performative, even manipulative. But when used with intention, and then deliberately dialed back, it creates a powerful contrast that makes your ordinary presence feel not just authentic, but magnetic. The mechanics of overloaded charm rely on a fundamental truth of human perception. We don't judge qualities in isolation, but in relation to what came before. When someone showers you with attention, remembering every detail you've ever shared, laughing a little too hard at your jokes, leaning in with almost exaggerated interest, it sets a new baseline for their behavior. But if, after a short period, they return to a more measured, grounded demeanor, that shift is interpreted not as withdrawal, but as sincerity. The earlier intensity becomes a foil, making their current calm feel refreshingly real. It's as if they've revealed their true self only after the performance has ended. And because the contrast is so stark, their normal state, once unremarkable, now radiates authenticity. This isn't deception, it's perceptual recalibration. By briefly occupying the role of the overly charming, you make your natural self appear more honest, more trustworthy, more human. Of course, this only works if the shift is subtle and timely. The overload must be brief, just enough to register, not enough to alienate. A few interactions of heightened warmth, followed by a gentle return to equilibrium, is all it takes. The key is that the pullback isn't coldness, it's quiet consistency. You don't stop being kind, you simply stop performing kindness. And in that transition, people breathe a sigh of relief. They feel they've moved from a stage to a living room. The relief itself becomes part of your appeal. You're no longer trying to win them over, you're simply being with them. And in a world saturated with curated personas and relentless positivity, that unvarnished presence feels like a rare gift. What makes this dynamic so psychologically potent is that it exploits our deep craving for authenticity. We are wired to detect incongruence, to sense when someone's outer behavior doesn't match their inner state. Overloaded charm, when sustained, triggers that alarm. But when it's followed by a return to a more restrained, steady presence, the brain interprets the latter as the real version. The earlier excess becomes a momentary flourish, not the core identity. And because we value consistency, we anchor our perception to the calmer, more sustainable state. In effect, you've used a brief burst of intensity to reset expectations, and in doing so, made your ordinary self extraordinary by comparison. This reveals a quiet truth about social dynamics. Charm is not an absolute trait, but a relative one. It's not about how charming you are, but how your charm compares to the norm, both societal and personal. By temporarily exceeding that norm, you create a new reference point. And when you step back, you don't just return to baseline, you elevate it. Your quiet nod now feels more meaningful than someone else's exuberant praise. Your simple "how are you" carries more weight than a rehearsed monologue of concern. You've trained others to see depth in your restraint. Yet this approach demands emotional intelligence. Overloaded charm must never feel mocking or cynical. It should arise from genuine warmth, just amplified for a moment, so that the return to normalcy feels like a homecoming, not a retreat. The goal isn't to trick people into liking you, but to help them see you more clearly by first showing them a slightly distorted reflection. In that distortion, the truth becomes more visible. And once that authenticity is established, you can deepen trust even further, not by revealing everything, but by revealing just enough. Because sometimes, the most disarming form of honesty isn't full disclosure, but a carefully chosen fragment. A partial truth, offered with humility, can feel more genuine than a complete confession, precisely because it implies there's more beneath the surface. This is the art of the next psychological nuance. The half-truth confession. There is a quiet magic in the art of selective honesty. We often assume that trust is built through full disclosure, that the more we reveal, the more credible we become. But human psychology operates on a more nuanced principle. Sometimes, admitting a small, carefully chosen flaw makes everything else about you seem more truthful by association. This is the half-truth confession, a minor, non-damaging admission offered not to unburden the soul, but to create an aura of transparency so convincing that your unspoken truths are assumed to be equally innocent. I still check my ex's Instagram sometimes. I pretend to read emails I don't understand. I've never actually finished a book I claimed I loved. These aren't confessions of moral failure, they are humanizing glimpses into universal, low-stakes imperfections. And because they feel relatable and self-aware, they trigger a powerful cognitive bias, the halo effect. One honest-seeming trait casts a glow over everything else, making your silence, your omissions, even your strategic reticence appear not as concealment, but as discretion. The half-truth confession works because it satisfies our deep craving for authenticity without demanding vulnerability that could destabilize a relationship or situation. By volunteering a small piece of your inner world, something slightly embarrassing but ultimately harmless, you signal that you have nothing to hide. The brain, eager to simplify complex social judgments, extrapolates, if they're willing to admit this, they must be honest about everything else. This is especially effective in professional or early-stage relational contexts, where full transparency might be inappropriate or premature. A leader who admits, "I was wrong about that timeline, I underestimated the complexity," doesn't just show humility, they make their unspoken decisions, their private doubts, even their strategic silences feel principled rather than secretive. The confession becomes a proxy for integrity. But this technique walks a razor's edge. Too much disclosure, especially of emotionally charged or ethically ambiguous material, can overwhelm the listener, shifting the dynamic from trust-building to emotional labor. Share a deep insecurity too soon, and you burden the other person with the weight of your fragility. Share something too trivial, "I hate folding laundry," and it feels like a placeholder, not a revelation. The sweet spot lies in the realm of the socially acceptable flaw, something that reveals your humanity without threatening your competence or stability. It should evoke a knowing chuckle, not concern. It should say, "I'm like you, not I need you to fix me." When calibrated correctly, the half-truth confession doesn't just build trust, it builds likability. It makes you feel approachable, grounded, refreshingly real in a world of curated perfection. What makes this approach so psychologically potent is that it leverages the asymmetry of perception. You control what is seen, and by extension, what is assumed about what remains unseen. The listener doesn't just accept the confession at face value, they project honesty onto your entire persona. Your silence becomes thoughtful, not evasive. Your confidence becomes earned, not arrogant. Even your successes feel more legitimate because you've shown you're not above small, human stumbles. This is influence through implication, a quiet suggestion that because you're honest about the small things, you must be trustworthy with the big ones too. Of course, the ethics of the half-truth confession hinge on intent. If used to obscure genuine deception or manipulate perception, it becomes a form of emotional sleight of hand. But when rooted in genuine self-awareness, and offered with humility rather than calculation, it serves as a bridge. It says, "I'm not perfect, and I don't expect you to be either." In that shared imperfection, connection deepens. And once that connection is established, you can gently guide someone not by pushing them toward a new version of themselves, but by calling them back to an old one. Because sometimes, the most powerful motivation isn't forward-looking, it's nostalgic. We don't always need to become someone new, we need to remember who we once were, and still are at our core. This is the quiet pull of the old you call back. Nostalgia is often dismissed as mere sentimentality, a wistful glance backward with no real power to shape the present. But in truth, nostalgia is one of the most potent motivators we possess. It doesn't just recall the past, it resurrects a version of ourselves we once knew and, deep down, still long to embody. This is the quiet force behind the old you call back, the gentle invocation of a past identity not to dwell in memory, but to awaken dormant potential. Remember when you used to write poetry? I've never forgotten how you stood up for that intern last year. You were always the one who saw the big picture. These aren't just compliments about bygone days, they are invitations to return. And because we are profoundly loyal to our past selves, especially the ones we admired, such a callback doesn't feel like pressure to change, it feels like an opportunity to come home. The old you callback works because it bypasses the resistance that often accompanies calls for growth or improvement. When someone is asked to adopt a new behavior, be more assertive, more creative, more compassionate, they may feel they are being asked to become someone they're not. But when reminded of a time when they already were that person, the task transforms. It's no longer about transformation, it's about reconnection. The desired trait isn't foreign, it's familiar. It's already part of their story. Psychologists call this identity-based motivation. We act not because we're told to, but because the action aligns with who we believe we are, or once were. By referencing a past self that embodied courage, curiosity, or kindness, you're not imposing a new standard, you're reminding them of an old truth. And in that reminder, the path forward feels less like a climb and more like a return. What makes this approach so emotionally resonant is that it honors continuity over reinvention. In a world that constantly demands we evolve, optimize, and become better versions of ourselves, the old you callback offers a gentler narrative. You don't need to become someone new. You simply need to remember who you've always been at your best. This is especially powerful during periods of burnout, doubt, or transition, when someone has lost touch with their core values or passions. A single phrase, "You used to light up when you talked about this," can reignite a spark they thought had gone out. It doesn't shame them for their current state, it lovingly points them back to a self they never truly lost, only misplaced. Of course, the effectiveness of this callback depends entirely on authenticity. It must reference a real moment, a genuine quality, not an invented ideal. If the past self you invoke feels fabricated or exaggerated, the gesture collapses into flattery. But when it's rooted in truth, when it names a real chapter in their story, it lands with the weight of recognition. They don't just hear your words, they feel seen across time. And because identity is not fixed but fluid, that past self is never truly gone. It lives in the neural pathways of memory, waiting for a cue to re-emerge. The old you callback provides that cue, not as a command, but as a compass. This reveals a deeper truth about human motivation. We are not driven solely by future rewards, but by the desire to remain consistent with our self-narrative. We will go to great lengths to prove that we are still the kind of person who writes poetry, who speaks up, who cares deeply. And by framing growth as a return rather than a departure, you remove the fear of losing oneself in the process of change. Yet even the most resonant identity needs a context in which to thrive. And sometimes, that context is defined not by who someone is, but by how irreplaceable they are within a system. Because when a person believes they fill a role no one else can, their sense of purpose sharpens, their commitment deepens, and their presence becomes indispensable. This is the subtle power of scarcity, not of things, but of roles. And that brings us to the scarcity role. There is a quiet alchemy in becoming indispensable, not through force, not through demand, but through the subtle cultivation of a role that only you can fill. In a world where attention is fragmented and talent is abundant, true influence often belongs not to the loudest voice, but to the one that occupies a space no one else inhabits. This is the essence of the scarcity role, the strategic positioning of yourself as uniquely equipped to solve a specific problem, interpret a complex dynamic, or fulfill a nuanced need. You're the only one who really understands this client. No one else sees the patterns you do. If you weren't here, this whole thing would fall apart. These aren't boasts, they are reflections of a niche you've quietly carved through consistent, distinctive contributions. And because human psychology equates scarcity with value, occupying such a role doesn't just make you useful, it makes you irreplaceable. The scarcity role works because it taps into a fundamental economic and psychological principle. We assign greater worth to what is rare and non-substitutable. In the marketplace of relationships and collaboration, this translates into trust, deference, and influence. When others believe that only you possess the insight, skill, or perspective required to navigate a particular challenge, they don't just consult you, they rely on you. And that reliance creates a form of soft power that doesn't require authority or title. It emerges organically from the perception that your presence fills a gap that would otherwise remain empty. Crucially, this role doesn't need to be grand or dramatic. It can be as specific as mediating between two conflicting team members, translating technical jargon for non-experts, or remembering the personal details that make clients feel seen. The narrower and more essential the function, the stronger the scarcity effect. But the most mind-bending aspect of the scarcity role is that it can often be created, not just discovered. You don't need to wait for a unique talent to be recognized. You can cultivate it through deliberate, repeated action. By consistently offering a perspective no one else provides, perhaps by asking the unasked question, noticing the overlooked detail, or bridging two disconnected worlds, you gradually become associated with that function in the minds of others. Over time, people begin to say, "We need you in this meeting, you always catch what we miss," or "only you know how to talk to her when she's stressed." The role wasn't assigned, it was earned through pattern behavior. And once it's established, it becomes self-reinforcing. The more you fulfill the role, the more others expect you to, and the more your absence is felt. In this way, scarcity isn't just a condition, it's a practice. Of course, authenticity is the bedrock of this dynamic. If the role feels contrived or inflated, it collapses under scrutiny. The scarcity role must be rooted in genuine competence and consistent delivery. It's not about claiming uniqueness, it's about embodying it so steadily that others can't help but notice. And when it's real, it doesn't breed arrogance, it fosters responsibility. You become the keeper of a quiet flame, and others trust you not to let it go out. Yet even this carefully cultivated role is ultimately a vessel for something deeper, the power of ideas that feel self-generated. Because the pinnacle of influence isn't getting someone to agree with you, it's getting them to believe the idea was theirs all along. This is the final, most subtle layer of psychological finesse, not persuasion, but suggestion. Not declaration, but implantation. And that brings us to the quietest hack of all, one that leaves no trace, yet shapes thought from within. Seated opinions. The most enduring influence is the kind that leaves no fingerprints. It doesn't arrive as a directive, a debate, or even a suggestion. It slips in unnoticed, like a seed carried on the wind, and takes root long after the conversation has ended. This is the essence of seated opinions, the art of introducing an idea so casually, so gently, that the listener absorbs it without ever realizing it came from outside themselves. You might say, "I heard someone mention that deadlines actually stifle creativity," or "It's funny, someone once told me that the best decisions are made when you stop trying to control the outcome." There's no insistence, no attribution to yourself, no call to agreement. Just a passing thought, offered like a pebble dropped into still water. And yet, days or weeks later, that same person might passionately argue the point, as if it were their own insight all along. Seated opinions work because they bypass the brain's natural resistance to external influence. When someone presents an idea directly, "You should think this way," our defenses rise. We scrutinize, we debate, we push back, not necessarily because the idea is wrong, but because autonomy is sacred. But when an idea is introduced indirectly, through a third-party anecdote, a rhetorical question, or a musing framed as idle curiosity, it slips past the gatekeepers of skepticism. It doesn't feel like persuasion, it feels like discovery. And once internalized, the mind treats it as self-generated. This is the pinnacle of psychological influence, not convincing someone to adopt your view, but creating the conditions in which they arrive at it themselves. The idea becomes theirs, and because of that, they defend it with a fervor no external argument could ever inspire. What makes this technique so profoundly effective is that it aligns with a core truth of human cognition: we are most loyal to the thoughts we believe we created. Ownership transforms opinion into identity. An idea we think is ours isn't just something we agree with, it's part of how we see the world, and by extension, ourselves. That's why seated opinions, once adopted, are nearly impossible to dislodge. They're not held lightly, they're woven into the fabric of personal belief. And because the origin is forgotten or misattributed, there's no resentment toward the source, only conviction in the idea itself. Of course, the ethics of seated opinions hinge entirely on intent and content. When used to promote empathy, curiosity, or ethical reflection, I wonder if we're underestimating how hard this is for them. It becomes a form of gentle guidance, helping others expand their perspective without confrontation. But when used to manipulate or implant harmful beliefs, it crosses into psychological coercion. The line is drawn not in the method, but in the motive. True-seated opinions aren't about control, they're about invitation. They offer a new lens, then step back and let the other person look through it on their own terms. Mastering this approach requires patience, humility, and restraint. You must be willing to never receive credit, to watch your idea flourish in someone else's voice, to let it grow without your name attached. In a culture that prizes visibility and attribution, this is a quiet rebellion. But it is also the purest form of influence, because it respects the other person's autonomy while still shaping the landscape of their thought. And so, as we reach the end of these 27 mental pathways, consider this: the deepest connections aren't built through dominance, but through resonance. Not by telling others what to think, but by creating the space where their own minds can wander, wonder, and arrive, seemingly on their own, at new truths. Take a breath. Let that settle. These 27 mental hacks aren't about control. They're not tools for manipulation, nor are they shortcuts to dominance. At their core, they are lenses, subtle, reflective surfaces that reveal the quiet currents flowing beneath every human interaction. They illuminate the invisible architecture of trust, the unspoken rhythms of rapport, and the delicate dance of influence that unfolds in glances, pauses, and carefully chosen words. To understand them is not to wield power over others, but to recognize the shared machinery of the human mind, the longing to be seen, the need to belong, the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, truly gets us. In that recognition, empathy deepens. Connection becomes less mysterious, not because it's engineered, but because it's understood. Use them wisely. Use them kindly. These phrases are not mere afterthoughts, they are the ethical compass for everything that came before. Every technique described here carries the potential for both healing and harm, depending on the intention behind it. When used with respect, humility, and genuine care, these patterns can mend misunderstandings, bridge divides, and create spaces where people feel safe enough to be their truest selves. But when used cynically, even the gentlest hack can become a form of emotional coercion. The difference lies not in the method, but in the heart. Ask yourself, am I seeking to connect, or to conquer? To illuminate, or to exploit? The most enduring influence is that which leaves the other person feeling more whole, not more used. And as you drift off tonight, perhaps with these ideas still echoing softly in your mind, remember this: the greatest advantage isn't in changing others. It's not in crafting the perfect phrase, timing the ideal pause, or mastering the art of subtle suggestion. The real power, the quiet magic, lies in seeing. In truly seeing the hidden patterns that connect us all, the shared vulnerabilities, the mirrored hopes, the universal desire to matter. When you understand that every person you meet is navigating their own unseen storms, carrying their own silent burdens, and reaching, however clumsily, for connection, your interactions shift. You stop trying to win, and start trying to witness. And in that witnessing, you don't just gain an unfair advantage, you gain something far rarer: humanity, reflected back at you, again and again, in the eyes of another. Sleep well.